are lots of people who think that the Bank of England hasn't been aggressive enough. Although it was the first major central bank to raise rates following the pandemic, it's taken a very slow, softly approach, with most of the 7 increases that we've seen so far this year only coming in at 0.25%. And because of that, we've seen the pound take an absolute hammering against other currencies, particularly the dollar. Now, the dollar, of course, is gaining ground because it is seen by many people, many investors, as a safe haven currency. But there are also big concerns about exactly how strong the Bank of England has been in terms of bringing down inflation, and also now with this economic impact assessment of how the UK economy is looking, and the fact that it's not looking particularly great at all. This is going to just increase the jitters being felt in markets.
And Danny, given the impact that we're seeing on energy prices and therefore feeding through into inflation from the war in Ukraine, are we clear yet that raising interest rates is going to have the intended effect on inflation?
You know, I've been contacted by so many people on social media today saying surely inflation is being created by things like the situation in Ukraine and supply issues, which were, you know, a headache of what happened during COVID. The issue is that those price rises are here and they're becoming entrenched in the UK, which is meaning that employers are having to pass those additional prices onto the consumer, and employees are asking for higher wages. So we've seen a whole load of wage agreements which are nowhere near inflation, but certainly higher than those pay deals would have been without inflation being at the point that it currently is. By making it more difficult to borrow money, by tightening things up, it means that people will spend less. It means that companies will think twice about giving those extra pay increases. And hopefully it will mean that inflation doesn't get sticky, it doesn't stay around, it doesn't become stagflation. We've also got the situation here in the UK, of course, where the government has stepped in and given assistance to both businesses and the consumers with their energy bills. And because of that intervention, it is expected that inflation won't peak anywhere near as high as it was expected to, and it will peak a lot earlier at around 11% next month. But with all that additional fiscal stimulus in, there is concern that potentially it does mean that inflation, though it won't hit those highs we were expecting, it will stick around certainly through most of next year.
Thank you, Danny. That's Danny Hewson, financial analyst at AJ Bell. Russia and Ukraine have carried out an unexpected prisoner swap. It's the largest since the war began in February, as it involves more than 200 people, including 10 foreigners. The prisoners released by Russia also included 10 fighters from the United States, Britain, Morocco, Sweden and Croatia. These prisoners were facing death penalties or life prison terms in Russia. UK Prime Minister Liz Truss has thanked the Ukrainian President and Saudi Arabia for helping in the brokering of the release of British citizens. It came as a surprise given Russian President Vladimir Putin had just announced a partial troop mobilization. That move enraged some Russians. From Moscow to St. Petersburg, people came out onto the streets decrying the war.
I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of anything. The most valuable thing that they can take from us is the lives of our children. I won't give them my child's life.
In Ukraine, Russian forces fired 9 missiles at the southern city of Zaporizhia. According to the regional governor, at least one person was killed, with others trapped under the rubble. Ukraine's armed forces say Russia launched 8 missiles and 16 airstrikes and fired 115 anti-aircraft missiles in the last 24 hours. They say the targets were military and civilian targets, mostly in the Zaporizhia and Donetsk areas. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed the United Nations. He urged world leaders to unite against Russia's war in Ukraine and strip Moscow of its veto power at the United Nations Security Council.
A crime has been committed against Ukraine, and we demand just punishment. The crime was committed against our state borders. The crime was committed against the lives of our people. The crime was committed against the dignity of our women and men. The crime was committed against the values that make you and me a community of the United Nations. And Ukraine demands punishment for trying to steal our territory. Punishment for the murders of thousands of people. Punishment for tortures and humiliations of women and men. Punishment for the catastrophic turbulence that Russia provoked with its illegal war, and not only for us, Ukrainians, but for the whole world, for every nation that is represented in this hall of the UN General Assembly.
NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg is accusing Russian President Vladimir Putin of dangerous and reckless nuclear rhetoric. Stoltenberg says Putin's mobilization of thousands of extra troops for the war in Ukraine will escalate the conflict, and he insists that Vladimir Putin's latest moves demonstrate that the war is not going according to the Russian president's plans.
This is dangerous and reckless nuclear rhetoric.
The chief of NATO on Wednesday said Russian President Vladimir Putin's thinly veiled threat to use nuclear weapons was, quote, dangerous and reckless.
He knows very well that a nuclear war should never be fought and cannot be won, and it will have unprecedented consequences for Russia.
In an exclusive interview, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg told Reuters editor-in-chief Alessandra Galloni that Putin will not win the war in Ukraine, despite his order to call up hundreds of thousands of extra troops in Russia's first mobilization since World War II.
The speech, the partial mobilization of the armed forces of Russia, just demonstrate that he miscalculated, he made a big mistake, strategic mistake, and that's the reason why they know how to do this.
В своей агрессивной антироссийской политике Запад перешел всякую грань.
Putin earlier on Wednesday called up 300,000 reservists to fight in Ukraine and backed a plan to annex parts of that country. He also hinted a readiness to use nuclear weapons, saying, quote, if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will use all available means to protect our people. This is not a bluff. The announcement followed mounting casualties and battlefield setbacks for Russian forces, who beat a humiliating retreat from parts of northeast Ukraine after Kiev launched a counteroffensive this month.
What does Ukraine need now, and what does the West need to give?
So we have stepped up both when it comes to the magnitude, but also the quality of the weapons we are providing.
But Stoltenberg was not optimistic the war in Ukraine would end anytime soon.
It's hard to see a solution in the short term as long as Russia doesn't accept that Ukraine is a sovereign independent nation. So I'm afraid that the only way to end this war is to prove that President Putin will not win on the battlefield. When he realizes that, he has to sit down and negotiate a reasonable agreement with Ukraine.
UK Prime Minister Liz Truss says economic strength in democracies could help push back authoritarianism. In her first major international speech as Prime Minister at the United Nations General Assembly, she also defended her plans for economic reform as a boost, she says, to the free world.
There is a real struggle going on between different forms of society, between democracies and autocracies. And unless democratic societies deliver on the economy and the security that our citizens expect, we will fall behind. We need to keep improving and renewing what we're doing for this new era, demonstrating that democracy delivers. The free world needs this economic strength and resilience to push back against authoritarian aggression and win this new era of strategic competition.
US President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Liz Truss met in person for the first time since she took on the role. Both expressed their commitment to protect Northern Ireland's peace agreement.
Both are committed to protecting the gains of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. I'm looking forward to hearing what's on your mind and how we can continue to cooperate.
And of course, I'm looking forward to discussing the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and how we make sure that's upheld into the future.
Well, according to Liz Truss's office, they agreed that Russian President Vladimir Putin's actions highlight the need for allies to continue their economic and military support to Ukraine. Liz Truss also met with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. According to Downing Street, they discussed Ukraine's recent territorial gains and Erdogan's role in securing grain exports through the Black Sea. In an effort to strengthen the country's energy supplies and security, the UK has formally lifted a ban on fracking for shale gas, which has been in place since 2019. Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg says all sources of energy need to be explored. Fracking involves extracting shale gas from rocks by breaking them up with water and chemicals at high pressure. The ban was put in place after the industry regulator said it was not possible to predict the magnitude of earthquakes that it might trigger. Fracking operations were paused every time the practice caused an earthquake of 0.5 magnitude or higher. According to the government, ending the ban will allow drilling to restart and more data will be gathered. Anti-fracking protests have been held in front of the UK's Parliament in London.
Bin the bill! Ban fracking! Bin the bill!
If this isn't the end of the road for fracking, then we will continue to organise.
Italy goes to the polls this weekend. In the south of the country, poverty levels and unemployment are comparatively high. Ahead of the September the 25th elections, many voters feel they've been let down and left behind by the government. Some wonder how they will get through the winter as energy costs spike.
Many people in Italy's southern town of Salerno are dependent on charity kitchen. Many in the region do not have enough money to pay their rent, bills and for food. The kitchen in Salerno serves 140 meals every day. However, rising inflation has made it difficult for the heads of kitchen to meet everyday demands. Heads of the Salerno Soup Kitchen feel that the demand will grow in the coming days. This, as far-right leader Giorgia Meloni has promised to abolish a poverty relief scheme if she gets elected in Sunday's general elections.
There are people who do get citizen income or who have a minimum pension, but they don't make it to the end of the month because of the rise in the price of food and bills. So we will see many more coming in the future.
The cost of living crisis in Italy has exacerbated by Russia's war in Ukraine. The effects of the crisis have been felt the hardest in southern Italy. Energy is also a major concern in Italy. The country has been heavily reliant on Russian gas. According to an Italian think tank, the Campania region has the largest number of people who are struggling to pay gas and electricity bills.
A recent study says that 1 in 13 people are at risk of extreme poverty. The whole province and the city of Salerno itself is facing a complicated situation after the pandemic and the war in Ukraine.
Italy is one of the 6 European Union countries without a national minimum wage. Instead, the country has citizens' income. This came into effect in 2019. Nearly 2.5 million people take this benefit, which has been put in place to help the jobless. On average, it costs around $550 a month per person. This has cost Italy a sum of over $8 billion this year. Interestingly, 1.7 million people of the 2.5 million live in the southern region of the country. 10% of the households in the region live in absolute poverty. To make matters worse, benefits provided by government are targeted by fraudsters. This has prompted Italy's far-right party to say that they will ditch the scheme altogether.
If Giorgia Meloni wins and cancels the citizens' income, there will be a flood of people coming here.
Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
And finally, an ancient shipwreck has been found off the shore of Israel. It's the largest of its kind. I'll leave you with that story. Do stay tuned to WION, and I'll see you at the same time tomorrow.
It's unique because of its size. It is about 20 meters long and 5 meters beam, which is the largest shipwreck we've ever excavated, and also because of its dating. It's dated between the 7th and the 8th century CE, which is the shift between the Byzantine and Islamic rule in the area. After the decline of the Byzantine rule in this area and the rise of the Islamic rule, then commerce almost stopped. There was no international commerce in the Mediterranean. We had mainly smaller vessels sailing along the coast doing cabotage. And here we have a large shipwreck, which we think the original ship was about 25 meters long, and we are being modest, laden with cargo from all over the Mediterranean.
This is right, Arab.